So welcome everybody. My name is Miriam Kavakov and I'm the Executive Director of Eshel, an organization that provides a future and a hope to Orthodox LGBTQ people and their families. We're so excited to welcome you to the second class in a 7-part series with Rabbi Steve Greenberg entitled Wrestling with God and Men. Today's class is called The Body and the Mind, Making Sense of Sex. Okay, Steve, take it away.
Again, thanks to everybody who helped put this together on the technical side. Thanks to Miriam. Thanks to Francesco. I want to. It's I've been kind of struggling with this process because I see your faces and I want to say hello to everybody, and it is going to be overwhelming. So at the end, please let's say hi. But I want to dive in. Firstly. I want to share my screen with a review because some of you might not have been here last week. And it's just very quick what happened in our last episode. So the reason I begin with creation is because you can't actually solve this problem around gender and sexuality without addressing Genesis, because the story is so binary and so heteronormative. So what I just wanted to demonstrate in one session was the following pieces that emerge out of the reading of the story is that creation, while about order, day, night, light, dark, land, sea, right, is also about messiness. Matter is not compliant with God all the time. If you look at the story, the waters cry to be separated, the moon and the sun argue about power, and specifically that question is around the issue of two. God is one. The moment there's another, there's conflict about who's in charge. Twos lead to conflict. One gets diminished. That's a solution, but it's not a great. God, we learn in the story, is beyond gender in the text, and so is the human being, the original human being, at least in the read of the rabbis, because to be in the image of God means also to be both male and female. That creature, that androgynous creature, is lonely, gets split in half. In other words, gender becomes a solution to loneliness, not the original intent of creation. And then it too leads to conflict between, who's in power, and hierarchy becomes the solution, but it's a flawed one. More about that later. The most important thing to grasp from that original learning is that the presumption of a world of male and female union, hetero, sexual union that leads to a blissful outcome is overplayed, and indeed the rabbis themselves discover much more complexity and much more aliveness in that, and therefore exploring the question of how the reality of homosexuality can be explored religiously isn't any longer a kind of challenge to the orders of creation, because the orders of creation are already challenged. So with that, we're going to move into the I would say, this verse is kind of what you might call the scene of the crime. This is the verse from which all the negativity around same-sex relationships seems to emerge. And so what I want to do is begin, before we go further, with a kind of parsing out of the text. And if I was, we were, having the opportunity to be together, it might be fun to kind of explore this interactively. But I'm just going to tell you what the problems are. There are at least 4 problems with the text of Leviticus. And as I kind of open it up, see if you can come up with, in your mind, with what you would say is, that's actually a little weird. So here's the verse. Ve'ed zachar, and with a male, lo tishkav, you shall not lie, mishkave isha, the lyings of a woman, toivahi, it's an abomination. So among the first problems that it will end up getting addressed much later in the series, but it's important to mention it now, is the text begins with the letter Vav. So it's an odd way to begin a text. It's not the only text that begins with Ve'et, but there are not that many. And by definition, a text that begins, how did that happen? a text that begins with and is problematic because it's telling you, well, this is connected to something that came before, but it's not always clear what it's connected to. So I want to just open up the problematic of this text is obviously self-situating, but it's not really telling you if it's the immediate past verse or the immediate beginning of the chapter. What is Ve'et connecting this verse to? Okay, we're going to leave that aside for now. That zachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha. Now, the other obvious piece here might be that this verse is more complicated than it needs to be, because it could have said, that zachar lo tishkav toivahi, and with a male you shall not lie. It's speaking to males. That's kind of all these verses of arayot are, and then why does it need mishkavei isha? Can't it be enough to say, with a male do not lie? It's an abomination. So the phrase mishkavei isha is problematic because it's not necessary, you might think. In addition, it's really not clear what it is, because it's a hapex legomenon. It means it appears only one time, in this case twice, but in the exact same context. So, in chapter 20, but the other appearance of it doesn't clarify. So the only thing you can do with a hapex legomenon is see if you can find some way to compare it. Of course, the simple way is that the word mishkav zachar, the phrase mishkav zachar, the lyings of a male, does appear. It appears in Bamidbar, in Numbers 31:18, when it says that a isha yodat mishkav zachar, a woman who knows mishkav zachar, is not a virgin, meaning she's experienced sexual intercourse. So mishkav zachar is what a woman experiences in intercourse. So then mishkav isha is what a man should experience in intercourse. So what does a woman experience? Penetration. What does a man experience? Engulfment. So then the text actually becomes clear, and with a male you shall not lie, in the manner of engulfing your penis in the body of the other, toivahi, it's an abomination. So mishkavei isha is a way of marking this as what male experience is, which is engulfment. And then the last question, or the second last question, is why the plural? Why does it say mishkavei? So the rabbis have a response to that, which is a really interesting one. They say, Yeshnei mishkavim be'isha. A woman can be penetrated in two ways, vaginally and anally. In the ancient world, at least in Judea, oral sex was not on the map and it wasn't considered sex. Anal and vaginal sex were. Which, by the way, this is the source text for the permission of married couples to have anal sex. Man can have anal sex with his wife because it's considered sex. And therefore legitimated. It's looked down upon in some circles, but the text permits it. It's called Bia Shelo Kedarka. So here you then have a further clarification of what this verse means, because a man doesn't have a vagina, so he can't sleep with a man the way he sleeps with a woman, but he can sleep with a man anally. A man doesn't have a vagina, but a man has an anus. And therefore, and with the male you shall not lie, the lyings that can be accomplished with a woman, i.e., at least anal intercourse, it is an abomination. So a couple of things. One is that this verse is only prohibiting a single act between men. It is also important to note that there is no verse that prohibits in the biblical canon same-sex relations between women, no specific verse. And so if that's the case, then same sexuality is not in the Hebrew Bible. It's not spoken about. What is prohibited is anal intercourse between men. And then our question is really a very different one. It's not why does the Torah prohibit homosexuality? It's why does the Torah prohibit anal sex between two men? Which is a very different question. Last thing I want to say is that the word toeva, we're going to do this quickly, people have kind of addressed this, pretty in many popular scenarios. It doesn't really add any weight to the text because too many things are called toeva to mark it as particularly unique. So the first time it appears is in Genesis. The Egyptians don't like to eat with Hebrews. It's toiva l'mitzrayim. It's an abomination for Egyptians to eat with strangers. This is historically kind of clear that Herodotus says that Egyptians wouldn't eat with Greeks. They wouldn't do all kinds of things. They wouldn't eat anything that a Greek had eaten on, like the dish. They wouldn't cut meat that a Greek had used as a carving knife. In other words, there were all these rules about who you get to eat with and who you don't get to eat with, and it was called toiva in the Hebrew Bible. And also, when Joseph explains to Jacob when he's speaking to Pharaoh, tell Pharaoh we want Goshen, and the reason is that we're shepherds, and it's an abomination to Egyptians. So what I want to claim is that the first meaning of toiva is that it's socially disgusting, socially yuck. That's what the first thing it means. The second thing it means, and I'm happy to send all these resources out to everybody, both for the first session and the second one. All you need to do is send me an email at steve@eshelonline.org. I'll be happy to send you all the sources. So toiva is used in so many different contexts, it kind of loses specificity. Yes, it's about incest, and yes, it's about all kinds of sexual practices, but it's about eating sacrifices late that have gotten too old, or eating animals that swarm, or creatures without skins, scales, and fins, idolatrous practices of all sorts, eating a blemished animal, consulting with soothsayers, bringing the price of a harlot into the temple, cheating others. In Proverbs, it's all this moral stuff. It's, there's 7 abominations to God: a haughty, bearing a lying tongue, shedding innocent blood, hatching evil plots, etc., etc. Oppression of the poor. In Ezekiel has a lot of use of toiva, breaking vows, lending on interest. In short, toiva is whatever is morally troublesome to the culture it's speaking to, or disgusting, or socially taboo. So with that frame, what you kind of get is that it doesn't add anything, because too many things are toiva. It just says this is something we don't do. We might not do it for a bunch of different reasons, but we don't do it, and God doesn't like that we do it. With that frame, what I want to move to is, here we go, the problem of why. So let me tell you how I got here. I now know, we now have the clarity that the verse in Leviticus prohibits anal sex between men. And the question is, why should the Torah prohibit a sexual act between men? What's the moral trouble of that? Particularly between human beings. One can understand a whole array of sexual prohibitions that are justified and make sense for all kinds of reasons. Incest makes the family dangerous. Adultery is the violation of a prior commitment, and in a way, a deception. There could be bestiality is crossing a boundary between, we're going to get to that later, between the human and the animal, and animals can't consent to sexual relations. Rape is prohibited because there's no consensuality and it's violent. So there's a whole array of reasons that other sexual prohibitions, what's wrong with a loving relationship between two men? Like, why should that be prohibited? And to ask that question, to ask why sex should be prohibited between men, particularly anal intercourse, that why becomes a remarkable touchstone in the modern period. So take a look at, I'm going to share with you Rav Moshe, but before we do Rav Moshe, this is too fun to not do, is that the legitimacy of asking why is really on the table with this question. Why, on any mitzvah, why to keep Shabbat, why to keep Tarat Mishpacha, why to keep kosher, why? The legitimacy of asking why is really on the table. What's interesting, Rav Moshe never says that it's prohibited to ask why about anything else, but on this issue he will. So just for fun, thinking again, the Duchess asked, with another sharp dig of her sharp little chin. I have a right to think, said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. just about as much right, says the Duchess, as pigs have to fly. I like this because in Boston, When Pigs Fly Bakery is one of our favorite places, and I can share that story offline of why he called his bakery When Pigs Fly, but it relates to our story. Anyway, back to Rav Moshe. So this is a tshuva, 1972, that is about both the issue of homosexuality and the issue, or same-sex relations between men, I should say, and the issue of the legitimacy of why. So here's the story. There was a text that was found by a Rabbi Daniel, a Swiss publisher, had begun to publish a text of Judah Chassid, Judah the Pious. It's a 11th, 12th century pietist in Regensburg, and they found this text that looked like a commentary of the Torah, and he published it. And when Rabbi Daniel read it, he sent it to Rav Moshe and said, I think this is a troubled text. And Rav Moshe wrote a tshuva that said the text is forged because it has heresies in it. So here's the tshuva. When the manuscript was sent to me by Rabbi Daniel, I saw in it another matter. The wicked had intended to weaken the prohibition of male homosexual intercourse, first by the question of why the Torah had prohibited. In itself, this is a great evil that weakens the prohibition for the wicked ones who have this ugly craving, which is so detestable that even the nations of the world know that there are no abominations like it. So it needs no reason, since it's an abomination despised by all the world. All understand that the transgressors of this sin are corrupt and not members of civilization at all. And when the reason is sought for this prohibition, the asking of such a question removes from the prohibition all obscenity, shame, disgrace, and completely disparages it. Rav Moshe is saying is that this text must be a forgery because it describes a failure to understand that that the prohibition is self-justifying. It's a taboo, not a rational prohibition. There's no reasons for this. This is so disgusting that even the criminals of the world know how inhumane and destructive this is. Now, what Rav Moshe is doing is actually really clear, because in 1969, he probably was aware that Stonewall occurred. And in 1973, already the published version of what was happening in the APA to remove homosexual relations from the lexicon of illness. In short, the world was shifting to see homosexual relations and not associating it with taboo any longer. And therefore, because of that, Rav Moshe was depending upon taboo in order to justify the prohibition. I don't think that Rav Moshe would have said the same thing about Shabbat or even about Taharat Mishpacha. There were works in extant at that time that were explaining why it's wise and reasonable for couples to avoid intercourse during menstruation. He didn't rail against rationalization of text or of mitzvot. In this case, he did, because the taboo was working and it began to fall apart. Now, I mean, this is not the only. Rav Moshe has another even more horrific, shorter tshuva, where he says that the very desire for homosexual relations is contrary to desire itself. The wicked have no inherent desire for this, so it must be that this is desired because it's prohibited, and the evil inclination seduces a person to rebel against God. In other words, a person who desires this really doesn't desire it, just desires to be destructive. It's a mumar lahach. It's a person who is in desire of this kind of thing. It's not real desire. It is rebelliousness. Now, here's what I want to say. Firstly, the reason that this was, it is troublesome is that it feeds on the worst frames of demonic, that homosexuality is demonic. And it is still used in a whole array of contemporary frameworks in right-wing religion that if we allow this, the sky will fall. It's not like the people who do it will be punished, but it will ruin us all. The taboos basically unhinge the world. And there are midrashim that claim that the flood came because, the orders of creation were violated, among them sex between men and sex between animals and humans. There's more to talk about this, and we'll get to it later in the series. But what I want to claim is that despite the fact that there is, that this occurred, that Rav Moshe wrote, it was very rarely to a halachic that dealt as if it was mahachis. There are going to be other, and we're going to find them, other rabbinic and Talmudic and medieval frames that claim that the prohibition between men for anal intercourse is a rational one. Now, before we move on, I'm not going to do this inside. I really wanted to, but I can see that we're not going to get finished if I do. So I'm going to give you the texts and tell you what we would have kind of moved through. But the question of whether reasons are good for law or bad for law is actually really alive. That's why in the Talmud one finds Darshinan Talmud Dekra, we interpret the reasons of the mitzvot to understand them, and Lav Darshinan Talmud Dekra, we don't. And one view is we don't because they are only gzerot, they are only decrees of the Holy One. So this is the first text in Brachot, that because if you look at the bottom here, that I've kind of highlighted at the very bottom of the Gemara, that all the mitzvot are not expressions of mercy or don't have any particular goal. They are nothing but the decrees of the king. However, that is only one view. There are two views in the Gemara. One is Lav Darshinan Talmud Dekra, we don't, and the other is Darshinan Talmud Dekra. Actually, and the Ramban actually quotes Maimonides. Take a look at the bottom here. I'm giving you just the end pieces of these. So with this, I just want to say that if you are smart, you will say because I said so. And the reason is that if you don't, you will be spending another 10 minutes arguing with the kid because all the authority will move from you to the reason. Reasons can minimize the impact and significance of law. However, the other side is true too. Reasons not only undermine law, they do. Law actually works because it's on the books and the reasons are hidden from view and you just got to comply. And authority matters. However, if you make rules but you don't reveal your reasons, you end up becoming an imperious dictator. And then the people who you're governing don't actually trust you. So reasons give law the feeling of good purposes. The prohibition is clear and the reasons don't matter. What I will claim is that, as the Rambam teaches, is not the only perspective. I recognize there's some things I do and I don't worry, like, I don't know, like I do them because that's what Jews do and that's what I do. And if I had to give a rationale for why I'm in my marriage every day, it would be complicated. I've just committed to the authority of my original, commitment, and then I'm in. So I want to put like a really interesting portrayal that as an Orthodox Jew, I do agree that mitzvot have authority outside of reasons. And I also believe that without reasons, we can't actually understand the goodness of the Torah, and it ends up becoming an imperious control frame. And then we actually detach from God, or we are mere slaves of God. And that doesn't work either. So with that frame, I'm going to dive into what in some circles in the traditional world would seem as either superfluous or problematic. And that is, ask the question, why does the Torah prohibit sex between men? Here we go. Now this is This is the Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. So why did the Torah prohibit sexual intercourse between males? Lama asrat Torah, ma asrat Torah l'shkav et hazachar, v'shelo lirvat behema. So both this and sleeping with, sex with animals is put together. And the answer is, all this is in order that men marry women and fulfill the command to be fruitful and increase. In other words, the rationale for the prohibition of same-sex relations between men is much like the Catholic Church would say, sex is for reproduction, and sex between men will not reproduce. Sex between women will not reproduce. So sex that's permissible is sex that allows for and actually intends for, I would say not even allows for, intends for the sustaining of the species. And he adds that even though this prohibition of male intercourse carries with it capital punishment, as we see in Leviticus 20, the duty to procreate is just a positive command, so it shouldn't, the abrogation of positive command usually doesn't result in death, right? So the Torah deemed it necessary, he says, to prohibit male intercourse so strongly in order to guard the law of procreation by erecting a high fence around it. Now, I don't know what you're thinking, but I would imagine that if I asked you, does this seem like a fair reason for the prohibition? You might already be wondering, well, how is that possible? Because a man can have sex with a pregnant woman. That sex will be procreative. With a woman after menopause, with a sterile woman. A man can have anal intercourse, as we just learned. There's a whole array of possibilities of sexual union that do not, will not lead to procreation. So sex, to be legitimate, might need, other things. Guf ne'enemi guf, say the rabbis. The body has to be pleasured by the body. And, there might be other, demands, but sex is not immediately illegitimate because it doesn't or can't be reproductive. And so the prohibition doesn't work very well to be a convincing rationale for the prohibition. I want to do a little bit more about this and then open up for conversation. The reason I want to do a little bit more about it, both emotionally but then also textually. Well, let's start. Let's start textually, and then I want to kind of think about the emotional impact of this. So there's another text that comes to mind when thinking about sex and reproduction, and it jumps off of this text in Genesis that appears after the flood. Shofech dam ha'adam va'adam damo yishofech ki b'tzer Elohim bara ha'adam va'atem puravu v'shirtzu ba'aretz uruvu ba. Whoever spills blood, the blood of Adam, by Adam shall his blood be spilled, for in the image of God did God, make Adam. So then, be fruitful and multiply and abound on the earth and increase on it. And this text is used by the Gemara in Yevamot to explain what is the punishment for not bearing children, for not getting married and having babies. It is taught, Rabbi Elazar says, whoever does not engage in producing children, it's as if he spills blood. Now, you might understand that if you don't have kids, then the kids you would have had aren't in the world. And so you're kind of, in a way, maybe metaphorically spilling blood. Whoever spills the blood of Adam, and they actually use the verse. Whoever spills the blood of Adam, by Adam shall his blood be spilled. For in the image of God did he make Adam. Therefore be fruitful and multiply. In other words, the relationship in being fruitful and multiply and not spilling blood is right here. Rav Yaakov says, no, it's not as if he doesn't, he spills blood. It's as if he diminishes the image of God in the world. Now, more or less, they're the same. One is focusing on the threat to the human community that not being reproductive, results in. Is that the world needs people. In fact, that's how life proceeds. It's also how the covenant proceeds. The second thing is, no, it's actually how God presence in the world becomes manifest through the image of God, which is the human. And so in the first, by not having kids, you threaten humanity. In the second, by not having kids, you threaten God. So Ben Azai says, because they ask him, well, what do you think? And he says, well, it's both. If you don't have kids, you threaten humanity and God. It's as if he spilled blood and just diminishes the image of God. They say to Ben Azai, one second, you never married, or if you did marry, you never had kids. So there are those who learn well, said Ben Azai. Ben Azai, by the way, was one of the 4 students of Rabbi Akiva, right? So, and it's famous that he did not have children. There are those who learn well and those who fulfill well. And there are those who fulfill but don't learn, and those who learn don't fulfill. So Ben Azai said to them, because that's their critique of him is, you're teaching us well, but you don't do it. Ben Azai said to them, look at this text right here. What shall I do? What shall I do? My soul lusts for Torah, and likely the world will be sustained by others. What a remarkable phrase. What shall I do means I'm stuck. Now, you might say to him, Ben Azai, why are you stuck? I mean, just get married and have kids. Now, here's why. My soul lusts for Torah. Well, why should that stop you from marrying a woman? I mean, Rabbi Akiva's soul didn't lust for Torah. I don't know. There's a lot of rabbis who had kids. And they lusted for Torah too. So he must be saying, my soul only lusts for Torah. I don't think he's saying he's gay. He's saying, I have no interest in sex or with a woman. I have no desire to pleasure a woman in sexual relations. So why should he, why does that matter? I have no desire to do without ham sandwiches, or especially BLTs. But okay, so what? Just because of the absence or presence of a desire doesn't mean you don't do the mitzvot of Hashem. So okay, you don't want to be with women, but you have to. You might not want to put on tefillin every morning, but it's a mitzvah. So why should not wanting be enough? And the answer must be is that when it comes to other mitzvot, you do it even if you don't want to, but you cannot engage in a loving relationship without desire, because it'll ultimately not be mutual with a spouse, and that will be humiliating, debasing, undermining. It will not create the mutuality of desire, which is what relationships thrive on. You will end up hurting people, especially your wife. And so, since my soul lusts for Torah and not for a woman, there's too much at stake. I can't do it. And don't worry, the mitzvah puravu is not on individuals alone, but likely the world will be sustained by others, meaning I will depend upon the fulfillment of others, and the world will go on. It's not going to depend only on me. And so what he claims is that, la halacha, while it's ideal to marry and have kids, one who doesn't can find other ways to, be fruitful and multiply. I actually think that's probably a limited translation, because Peru means, it means juicy. Uravu can mean many, but can mean great. So I love the translation, be juicy and great. And maybe there are other ways. And of course, Chazal you can adopt children, or you can be a teacher. You can find a way, this is my language, to benefit a world you will never see, because one of the powers of being a parent is that it invests you in a future you will never see, which is in deep ways a part of the covenantal consciousness. So if you're not going to have kids, how do you invest yourself in a world that will go on beyond your life? And kids are the easy or natural, or it's like ordinary, more common. I don't want to, overemphasize, but they're a way to do that, but not the only way. And so there are other ways to do it. If that's the case, then we see that while sexual relations are important. And the mitzvah pruvu is key for a Jewish sense of how life is valued by the Creator and us. There are other ways of committing to the vitality of life than that. And sex that doesn't do that is not by definition problematic. Now, I want to end with this psychological question and then open it up for some discussion. Psychological question is this. When people come out to parents, often the first round of issues is, will you be all right? Will I be all right? But fairly soon, the question is, oh, but the grandkids. And what I want to claim is that there is a loss in accepting oneself as gay that begins with, I may never have kids. And that is particularly in cultures, where reproductivity is really central to the cultural ethos. It can be really hard not to fit into that expectation. When you grew up in a family where the family experience was sweet and you want to repeat it and don't know how, it can be really difficult. Well, I want to claim that coming up with a way to understand the tie between sex and reproduction that makes sex dangerous for heterosexuals, but also incredibly creative, and to figure out what happens to sexuality that can never be quite that dangerous or quite that creative for gay people, and what do we as a community do with that question, I think is really key to belong to the Jewish people in a thoughtful way. It's not that everyone reproduces. That's actually blatantly not true. It's that on some level, our gayness becomes a factor in that has to be thought through. And with that question, not an easy one, but I think a rich one, we have some time. I've got a bunch of other texts that I want to finish with, if you'll let me, that kind of mark this in really a staccato way, and then we're going to be done. There's one verse in Genesis that gets a bunch of translations, and the difference between them is actually what we're talking about. Therefore, at the end of the second creation story, shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And this is, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, when the Adam creature is finally satisfied. And the question is, what does it mean, and they shall be one flesh? So Rashi says, the infant that's created of them, havlad notzar al yedei shneim sham naseh b'sar echad. In other words, what's one flesh? Their flesh becomes one in the baby. So there's something about union that happens in that one flesh. And I had to get over, for many years, I had this desire for Steve and I to produce a child that would be of our flesh, that would be of him and of me. And that was never to be true. Okay, so that's the first piece of this, the rub for reality that might not be easy, but I have to face is that. But then look what else happens. The Ramban says, no, well, Rashi believes that it's the child, but you know what? Even animals produce children that are of their bodies. So, and it can't be that. So what is it? It's that in his embrace, in the male's embrace, she is like his flesh. He desires that she be with him always. This is a kind of emotional connection that together their desire for each other becomes a shared sense of basar. They begin to see each other's bodies as an extension of their own. That's a kind of psychological union of one flesh that doesn't have anything to do with babies, right? Then Sforno says it actually goes back to our problematic in an interesting way that poses again more questions. It's not Sforno, it's the next one, Radak. Sforno says it's a similar one to the Ramban, but Sforno says that since they work together in such close union, their function together becomes like one flesh. In other words, they become a team. And it's not so emotional, it's actually pragmatic. And there's an absolute reality to this, that even when in coupledom, even when the emotional stuff is like not working perfectly, being able to function together as a team to accomplish stuff sometimes turns out to be enough, like for a while. And so that's how they are one flesh. They're one flesh because in their shared teamwork, they become like one being. And then the Radak says this: they come from the same flesh, meaning they all come, that original androgynous Adam or male Adam, whatever, both of them come from the same physical meat, but it's a reminder that when they're in intercourse, they do become one flesh. There's something about, intercourse different than just, mutual masturbation, that borders on feeling like you share a single body. And what's interesting to me is that while Radak imagines this, as the Rashi and Sanhedrin you'll see, as only between a male and a female, what's interesting to me is the ways in which gay couples do achieve a kind of interpenetration that feels like in the midst of sexual union, we can feel like we share a body. However, the misunderstanding of, and I have stories to tell about this having to do with the conservative movement's, acceptance of gay relationships, except anal intercourse, and we can talk about that, is that the reason that two men can't cleave together is because they won't have pleasure. And he shall cleave, v'davak bi'ishto, and then the Midrash says, v'lo davak v'lo b'zachar. So that's the Midrash in the Gemara. You can't cleave with a male. And why does Rashi say that the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that two men can't glue together? Because deleka dibuk, there's no dibuk, mitoch she'ein hanishkav ne'aneh ve'eno nidbakimo. Because the person who's on the receptive end of anal intercourse does not have pleasure and therefore is not glued into the other. This is the scenario of a straight man trying to figure out why anybody would enjoy anal intercourse on the receptive side. So given that, of course, that's actually not our experience, and probably, not the experience of at least a number of straight men as well. So I would say that what's remarkable here is the ways in which desire, relationship, love, reproduction are all kind of held together in this rationale in really interesting ways that don't make it simple for us, but make it profoundly interesting. And so with that, it's time to look at your questions and have a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go to some of the questions in the chat. There were 3 comments/questions in the chat that all kind of related to one thing that you had raised, which was that there are other ways to contribute to the world other than having children and fulfilling that mitzvah. So one comment, Ben Azai's answer undercuts the entire normative argument. Other people can maintain the continuity of humanity, and I will do other important things. Perhaps it should be conceded then that those who do not reproduce should do something else important to maintain and promote the future of humanity. And along with that, another question, I wonder what is the opinion of people who are unable to reproduce due to a medical condition?
So that's the same. It would be the same. In other words, here's my claim, and this is the tension: is the body is not fair. The body's not fair. Their bodies are all about certain capacities and other limits, and so some bodies can reproduce and some can't. some bodies can run the marathon, some can't. Some bodies have the capacity to become, Einstein level whizzes, and some can't. So the body is not, its resources are not equally, offered. And so because of that, while you can still claim that there's the desire for expression of a number of values, we find a way to assert that the image of God is in every human being, even ones that have very few capacities. But that doesn't mean that the capacities themselves are not an expression of divinity. There's an expression of divinity in creativity. There's an expression of divinity in reasoned argument. There's an expression of divinity in motion. Not everybody has motion. So what that means is that in the specific Pru is helping to articulate how reproduction serves the greater will of the divine toward the vitality of life, but it is not. You're exactly right that I think that the rabbis were aware of the fact that not everyone will have access to that, and therefore other means by which one would be basically, let me just say this, is that they say it explicitly. Noah ish tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav. Et Elohim yitalech Noah. So when it says, Noah, was a righteous man, why does it say he was a tzaddik and then it says he had kids? And the answer is that Ma'asim Tovim, the good deeds of a tzaddik, are his children. What I want to claim is that there are other ways to be productive, but that doesn't mean that the uniqueness of the body's capacity to reproduce is not precious. It is, because Abram and Sarah make babies. That is how the covenant is put forward into the world. And therefore, it has a special place in the tradition. But again, somewhat unfairly so. But it's because the body is not fair.
Okay. And then just to read this other comment very related to this is recently there was an Orthodox rabbi who noted that gay people, by not having a family tying them down, have many ways to help Jewish communities, even beyond their home base. And yes. This person's wondering if you have a perspective on that.
Well, I would say that I once gave a lecture about all that rituals in the life of a person, and I just did snippets from birth and Pidyon Haben and Brit Milah and baby naming and bar mitzvah and whatever. And a couple came up to me. She was crying and she said, "You've just described to me why I can't be a Jew." I said, "Oh my God, what did I do?" She said, "I cannot have a kid. Physically, I'm incapable, and we're not even able to adopt. And so the only ceremony I'm going to celebrate is a funeral." And so, I was devastated. I didn't know what to say. And then I said to her, "Look, I don't know where this came from. Abram and Sarah did not have children. They were a single couple with no kids for 60 years. And had they had a baby when, they were in their 20s, they would have had the baby and celebrated and closed the doors and shut the windows to not let in the scorpions and not let in the strangers, and they would never have become Abram and Sarah. It was the absence of children that allowed them to open the doors to anyone who passed by and to become, block parents for anyone in need, and ultimately not only the parents of their children, but the parents of a people. And then they had babies too. So I would say, are there ways you can see yourself as being freed from this burden in order to be a resource of parenting for people who aren't your children? And I don't know if it helped them, but at the time I was still single and childless. So I can tell you it would help me.
Would you say that there's an obligation for people that don't have children to do other things in their lives to contribute to society, more
Yeah.
so than people who do have children?
Yes, and the reason is that people who have children have really they've spent a lot of time in sargidul banim and in effort, and it's like there's not a lot of time left, and so all sorts of people who don't have children um, find ways and can find ways to use that time to be a servant, not only to society in general, but in this particular way, which is to raise a child is to say, I have faith in a world I will never see, and I'm investing in it. So invest in a world that will travel beyond you. And you can find ways to do that. You know, there are people in this call who find ways to do that, and I know them personally. I'm not going to name them. And they take care of people in many ways. And anyone can do that. And yes, I would say it's more incumbent upon you when you have fewer demands upon your time having to do with raising kids. And by the way, you know, people, when their kids leave home and go out and they're empty nesters, I think that it applies too.
So there's been some interesting chats about how, because our culture, the Jewish culture, revolves around family, when you're not, you know, blood ties with a family necessarily or have your own children, it's hard to feel included in that culture. And other relationships that are really important to family or raising children, like having an allied uncle or somebody who really cares about you who are not your parents, how that doesn't really have a place or a real value put upon it.
Yes, and so here you know, I think this is probably the most important thing to say in regard to Orthodox synagogues and helping them become inclusive, because as we're going to probably touch upon in other sessions, it really is difficult to integrate oneself into Orthodox life if you're not married, and certainly if you don't have, or if you don't have kids. It's hard to find a foothold in that space, but people succeed. I think it's really there are two things that have to happen. Orthodox environments need to be aware of the fact that childless, you know, I don't know how to put it in that way, but people without children and people without spouses need specifically to belong in ways that are really clear, and you need to find ways to highlight their centrality. You know, it's also in educational frames. I like to teach the Devorah, the prophetess, was in my view likely single. It's Eshet Lapidot, but I think that means is that she was a woman of Lapidot, not that she married a guy named Lapidot. Makes no sense. And so could there be a way to be a person of incredible power and efficacy and vitality and single? And I won't mention her name, but I know a wonderful woman who never married and never had kids, who is the life of many families, invites, you know, hundreds of families to her home and cooks, and is an incredible creative wizard, and is beloved by hundreds of people because she decided that she was going to insist upon being part of families in all kinds of ways. There are other ways to do it. In work, people do it. People decide that they're going to, you know, be an incredible caretaker of a class of people who contribute and develop and you know, the Orthodox or the traditional or the broader Jewish community in tzedakah. People become medical professionals and take care of people all the time, entering into their families. People develop incredibly tight friendships and become enormously important for other people's lives. There are many ways to be a servant and to the common weal. It's just that the recognition that when you have that extra time not dedicated either to a spouse or to kids, then use it. And that's, I think, just the takeaway for me.
Okay, thanks. There are a few questions about the texts themselves. So what if toivahi does not refer to the entire sentence? Where is the noun as antecedent, but to isha?
then what would, so I don't know who asked the question, but I don't know then what it would mean because, and with the male you shall not lie, the lyings of a woman, she is an abomination, but you're not lying with a woman. You're lying with a man as with a woman.
So
So
toeva refers to, he refers to toeva.
I still don't know what the verse then is prohibiting differently. I'm curious now to think it through, but I don't really know quite how that would solve the problem or address or even create a new reading. Like I don't know how it makes sense. Because there is no woman in this verse. There is a metaphor of sex with men using, what happens with women as the way to understand penetration, as a way to mark penetration. You could say, though, that and I've heard this, queer writers write, that to treat a man like a woman, not to treat a man like a man, but treat a man like a woman is toiva. But that is a wholly modern imposition that I don't think fits within the context of the chapter and doesn't seem to be salient. It seems like a nice, eisegetic reading, meaning it's good, we can read things we feel, but it just doesn't jump out of the text for me because the text is clearly addressing a sexual prohibition. And so it would be hard for me to figure out, it's in that chapter, how that would be parsed. If the person wants to continue explaining, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks. Here's another one. What's in the text and what's not in the text makes me wonder if this rule for men is more for the benefit of women. If you can have some relations as a man with a man, and you can have anal sex with your wife, it reads to me as requiring men to not sexually neglect their wives.
Well, you shouldn't. It's interesting that the text does, is used, as I said, to permit anal intercourse between a husband and a wife. We will get to other readings that do just what this questioner is saying, and that claims that the real problem, that's actually next time, the real problem of homosexuality is how it abandons wives. And we'll talk about that next time. And I think that as we move forward, not to give you, not to be a spoiler, to reveal too much in advance, but this text has more to say about gender relations and about women, the problematic of the demotion of women then isn't evident yet. But I do think that the questioner is hitting upon something, that the text will open up resources for thinking around how women are treated generally, and I think it's a good question to file in the back of your mind for the future.
Okay, here's the last one. So the verse uses zachar and isha, not ish or gever or nekeva. Could we read the verse as "don't lie with a male" instead of "with his wife"?
No, because you're not allowed to sleep with the wife either, so it would seem strange. I can explain why it's zachar and not ish. And the reason for that might be is that a zachar includes an underage male. A zachar is just a male. An ish is an adult. And so therefore, ve'et zachar, and with a male person, even one underage, lo tishkav mishkeve isha, because it's describing, it could have said mishkeve nekeva, but I think the reason it says mishkeve isha is because it's the other side. Well, no, it's an interesting point, because there in Bamidbar it says mishkav zachar, not mishkav ish. It's a really good question. I'm not exactly sure why the pairing of zachar. It may be that zachar and nekeva. It's an interesting question to ask. Are they paired in the biblical canon, or is it common to pair zachar and isha? And why would that be? So I'm going to put that in my thinking cap. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Okay, so this concludes our second class in the 7-part series, Wrestling with God and Men. And so come back again next week when we will have the third class.